Countdown to Halloween 2022, featuring eerie and uncanny tales of haunts, ghosts, and suspense. Every Monday at exactly midnight, a new story will appear on Storylink Radio's YouTube channel as we count down to Halloween 2022. You will have 7 days to listen, then the next one will appear. Each story will be 13 to 30 minutes long. And now, tonight's story from Storylink Radio. The Haunted Villa, a Christmas Legend of Louisiana by Joseph Ingraham. Is it a true and honest tale, fair master? Nay, I vouch not. I give it thee as I had it. In the upper faubourg of New Orleans, conspicuous from the river on which it fronts, stands a vast square mansion, gray and ruinous through neglect rather than time. A few old moss-stained oaks of a century's growth rear their majestic heads above its rank lawn, and the hedges and walls that once enclosed it are broken down or utterly destroyed. Everywhere are the marks of its having been, in a better day, the abode of affluence and aristocratic pride. Lonely, in a dilapidated grandeur, stately and imposing even in its ruin, it has for years attracted the eye of a curious stranger as he sailed past it. But vainly does the traveler seek to learn from those about him the history of the spot. All that he can ascertain is that it is called the Haunted Villa. Less than half a mile above this dilapidated edifice, on the estate adjacent, also stands a mansion, which is no less striking for its beauty, adorned as it is with verandas, porticos, and latticed conservatories, and half hid in the most luxuriant foliage, with well-appointed hedges of the rose-thorn interspersed with lemon, acacia, and pomegranate trees, enclosing a lawn of the softest green. Yes, this mansion seems the abode of taste, refinement, and graceful affluence, the home of domestic bliss and social happiness. Never two mansions or grounds presented stranger or more remarkable contrasts, made still more striking by their juxtaposition. At the latter villa, on the evening of our story, there was held a Christmas festival, of a gayer and more brilliant description than usual, for it was a bridal night also, and the bride and bridegroom with the joyous train mingled merrily in the holiday festivities. Ah, the bride! How shall her matchless beauty be given to the eye of the listener? She was of stately stature, graceful as the swan in her movements. Her eyes were dark and burning with the sight of love. There was an unfathomable well of feeling in their dangerous depths, and though they could occasionally flash fire and sparkle there, their usual aspect was soft and timid as the gazelle's. She was called Ifsa, and men's eyes have seldom looked on a more beautiful woman, or a bridegroom's worshipping glance adored a fairer bride. Ifsa was wedded the night of our story, in the gorgeous rooms of a mansion just described. The owner of this mansion was a French gentleman, and had been a widower for many years. He called Ifsa his child. Some said she was his daughter, others that she was not. There was evidently a mystery about Ifsa. She was just 18 the night of her bridal, which was as well both her birthday and wedding day, a Christmas Eve. The bridegroom was a rich young Creole of Orleans, handsome, chivalrous, well-born, in every way worthy to wear so bright a jewel as Ifsa in his bosom. It was a happy and merry night. All the youthful cavaliers from many leagues around were gathered there to grace the nuptials, and 60 maidens with the dark eye and raven hair of that sunny clime presented their rival charms in the presence of the incomparable bride. In the wanton waltz and stately dance, amid never-ceasing strains of ravishing music, and with the numerous scenes and changes of a bridal festival conjoined with a Christmas merrymaking, the silvery hours flew swiftly on. Midnight at length approached, and the blushing bride, half reluctant, half consenting, was borne from the hall by a group of laughing virgins to the nuptial chamber. At the instant the door closed behind her, the festival halls were strangely illuminated by a sudden light of pale green cast that outshone the brilliant candelabra in the rooms, and threw over every face the ghastly pallor of death. At the same instant a loud, heavy, rumbling noise like underground thunder appalled every ear. "Look, look, the haunted villa!" shouted several voices on the veranda. In an instant the halls were deserted, and the veranda and lawn looking in the direction of the ruined mansion were crowded with terrified gazers. Terrific spectacle, the whole interior of the ruin towards which their eyes were turned seemed to be on fire. Through every aperture of door and window and gaping crevice, the fire shone out as if from a furnace with an intense glowing heat. Yet there ascended no smoke from it, nor could there be heard any sound of crackling flames. But what was most fearful was a tongue of green flame, which rising from the midst of that molten mass flung itself lapping and curling high into the air like a serpent, and then contracted and coiled down upon the surface of the bed of fire, again to unfold and dart upward, and shed its baleful glare a wide league around. The most death-like silence pervaded the groups of banqueters as they looked upon this spectacle. To all, the name of the haunted villa was familiar, and to every mind supernatural terror was associated with it. No one breathed. Expectation and alarm sat on every face. Gradually the intensity of the glowing interior lessened. In a few minutes all became dark as before, save the tongue of flame which continued to curl and writhe above the central tower with a fiercer strength. All at once it disappeared, like a lamp blown out, and in its place a small globe of green fire that shone with a steady light was alone visible upon the summit of the tower. Awed and full of conjectures and trembling apprehensions, the company instantly broke up. In a few minutes nearly all were on their way to their own homes, anxious to place the widest distance between themselves and this spot of supernatural sounds and spectacles. 5 or 6 young men alone remained in the deserted veranda. They were intimate friends of the bridegroom, who himself stood among them as they discoursed together on the event. "Did you notice that it was just as the door closed behind the bride?" remarked Don Antonio Barradas, one of the group upon the colonnade. "I did, senor," replied Eugene Brissett with animation. "My eye was following her departure, surrounded by her bridesmaids, and methought I had never seen a woman so lovely, and I mourned that so bright a star should set to every eye but Henry's." "Yes, but you all noticed it was just as she left the room, signors," repeated Don Antonio, looking around with a marked manner and speaking in a solemn tone. "We did," all answered. "But if has anything to do with the—" "Speak, Don Antonio. What evil threatens was connected with my beloved bride?" demanded the young husband, earnestly grasping his friend's hand. "Listen, senor," answered Don Antonio Barradas. The young cavaliers, joined by 1 or 2 ladies, now grouped closer about the young Spaniard as he leaned gracefully against a column, his arms folded within his silk mantle across his breast. His attitude was striking and commanding. His age appeared not less than 30, but care or deep and active thought had worn in his face strong lines, which, while they added to its intellect, took away from his youth. He had been very handsome, and was still striking for his manly appearance. His figure was tall and slender and finely shaped. His complexion was so dark as to approach a swarthy hue. His features were finely aquiline. His large dark eyes beamed with the fire of intelligence. Sometimes there was in them a strangeness of expression, terrible to look upon, while ere it could be commented on by those who observed it, passed away, instantly followed by the sweetest smile human lips ever wore. With the early history of Don Antonio, really none were acquainted. He had come to New Orleans on a Christmas Eve, 8 years before, a traveler and as the heir of a noble Cuban family. After a sojourn of a few weeks, he gave out that he had become so much pleased with the city as to determine to abide there permanently. His lodgings were magnificently furnished, and In his horses and equipage he rivaled the wealthiest Creoles. He soon found friends, and the halls of the oldest and best families of the land were thrown open to him. He was admired for his wit, his accomplishments, and manly graces, and everywhere courted for his wealth. And thus, for 7 years, had Don Antonio lived among the hospitable and refined Orleanois. During all this while, it was remarked that he had never drank wine or spoken to a woman, though the loveliest in all the world were alluring him with their smiles. Between him and Henri de Clavière, the bridegroom, there had existed a long and close intimacy. He had now been invited to wait on him as a groomsman, but had singularly and strangely to his friend declined, saying he could be present only as a guest. "Allez, senor," he said in an impressive manner as his friends gathered around, their curiosity aroused by the tone and emphasis of his words. "It is 21 minutes yet to midnight, I think. There will be full time until 12 for me to speak. Patience, Henry. Thy bride hath not been gone 10 minutes, and thou must wait for the cathedral bell to toll the midnight ere thou leave us." "The cathedral bell? It was never heard at this distance," exclaimed several. "Yes, perhaps, but it will be heard here tonight, as if swinging within the dome of this very hall," he answered in a voice that with his words made each heart weigh heavier in the bosom against which it audibly throbbed. "Yes, yonder mansion, my friends, yonder mansion was built by a Castilian noble, in whose veins flowed the best blood of Spain. His wealth was inexhaustible. He possessed only boundless ambition, and never did human life stand between him and his object. His passions were evil, and indulged in any sacrifice. He lived solitary in a lonely castle amid the most fertile and lovely region of the Castile. There he associated only with his gold, which he kept in his coffers, in his vaults, and with his horse and black hounds, with which he used to hunt every Christmas Eve, from sunset to sunrise, in company, it is said, with the free spirits of the air, with whom, riding like the wind, they traversed the kingdom in its breadth and length ere the dawn. And what think you he hunted, my friends? A Castilian maid, who shall be both perfectly beautiful and perfectly blind. For there is a tradition in Spain, perhaps you know it, that such a maiden shall become the mother of an emperor, who shall unite all the kingdoms of Europe into one empire. But it was not for this he would possess this blind beauty. He was in person the ugliest and most hideous man in all of Spain. Men looked upon him with disgust, and women with fear. Oh, he wanted a wife, and forsooth one that was beautiful too, for next to his money and hounds he admired women. But alas, no female could be found to marry him, so hideous was his visage, for all the gold in his coffers. He had heard of this tradition, and the idea of having a bride who should be perfectly beautiful yet be blind was highly gratifying to his vanity, for he could feast upon her charms while she would be ignorant of his ugliness. "Well, why would he be seeking her by night, though?" demanded Don Antonio's listeners. "Ah, yes. It is said," continued Don Antonio, "it is said he had a talisman purchased by a mint of golden zecchino of Pius VI, by which he would be guided to the abode of such a maiden as this, who could be borne off, says the tradition, only at the midnight hour, and while buried deep in sleep. And so, at length, one Christmas Eve, when this Castilian noble was 30 years of age, he sallied forth with hound and horse and horn to seek the blind and beautiful maiden to be his bride. It was a few minutes before midnight that the priests, who were chanting prayers in a monastery in the Pyrenees Valley, heard the unusual sound of huntsmen and the hoarse bay of hounds approaching in full cry. The sounds came nearer and nearer, and grew louder, yet louder, All at once the wide doors of the chapel were burst open, and this young Castilian noble rode in at top speed, followed by his pack, and galloped straight towards the altar. The horror-stricken priest seized the golden crucifix and stood upon it and held it up between sacred place and the intruders, whom they believed to be the spirit of the wicked huntsman of the Pyrenees, and not a mortal man. And without heeding the priest or their crucifix, Don Rolando Osormo, for that was his name, leaped from his coal-black steed and passed through a small wicket that led into the cloisters of the nunnery. With a rapid step he traversed the corridor and stopped before a cell, the door of which was closed. But that door flew open at his touch, and therein, on a low couch, her features faintly visible by a lamp burning beside it, slept a nun of the most perfect symmetry of limbs and features. Don Rolando knelt beside her and lifted the lamp so as to obtain a more perfect view of her perfect face. And it was indeed transcendently lovely. He smiled with satisfaction, and lifting her in his arms in his deep sleep, he bore her forth into the corridor. "No, but how knew he that a maiden slept there?" asked one of the group. "By the talisman upon his whip, it is said."
"What talisman was that, Don Antonio?" another asked.
"As a lock of the very Virgin Mary's hair, braided in the snapper," says the legend. The pliant lash would straighten and point forward as he held it in his hand in the direction he should proceed. Its touch opened all barriers and gave him ingress into the inmost closet of castle or cot. But this impious noble was soon to learn that he could not enter, even with such a talisman, a consecrated temple and bear off with impunity a bride of the church. His punishment, though long deferred, his punishment came. He returned into the chapel with his prize ere the terrified monks had recovered from their astonishment. Leaping upon his steed and followed by his hounds, he spurred down the echoing aisles again and left the convent as the bell tolled midnight. The noise of his riding and the bay of his hounds breaking far and wide upon the stillness of the night as he coursed homeward down the valley. Don Rolando Osorno soon reached his castle and laid his intended bride upon a gorgeous couch. And then sending for musicians, he placed them in concealed alcove and bade them play the softest strains until she awoke. But Don Antonio, how was Don Rolando to be certain that this woman was blind as well as beautiful?
Questioned one of the group.
He believed in the faithfulness of his talismans.
"Well, for my part, how could she be beautiful if she were blind, Don Antonio?" asked Eugene Brissot. "Methinks a lady's beauty lieth mostly in her eye."
Yes, well, the tradition saith that the maiden in question is to be perfectly beautiful and still perfectly blind. So she must therefore have perfect eyes to the observer, though useless to herself as instruments of vision. Oh, the poor lady,
sighed the young cavalier.
"I pray thee, proceed with thy story, Signor Antonio, please," said the impatient bridegroom. Yes, it indeed becomes me to hasten, does it not? For the midnight hour is near at hand. And so Don Rolando Osorno, having arrayed himself magnificently and perfumed himself with the costliest essences of Persia, stood concealed behind the curtains of her couch to witness her awaking. At length the music stole into the lady's senses, and slowly she began to open her eyes and throw off the deep sleep that had weighed upon those fringed lids. Don Rolando watched her with the most intense interest. He trembled lest he should have been deceived, for already he passionately loved her. She rose in her couch and gazed around. Her eyes were as blue as heaven, large, liquid, and full of love and feeling. But whether they had vision, he was unable to determine yet. He was about to show himself to make the trial, but he restrained the impulse and chose to keep his hideous countenance still concealed, feeling assured that a few moments would decide it. The lady looked around her upon the damask hangings that on all sides enveloped her couch, but there was no individual object about her to arrest and fix the eye. She now threw back her golden hair from her forehead as if perfectly awake, and she gazed around with intelligent surprise too visibly depicted on her features, and in the enlargement of her dilating eye to be mistaken. Don Rolando's heart began to sink within him. She looked each moment more bewildered and alarmed. "Oh, Holy Virgin, where am I?" she cried at length, in a voice which alarm had made most sweetly touching. These silken hangings, this heavenly music, this gorgeous chamber. For she had now put aside the curtains. Whither have I been borne in my sleep? It were heaven did not yonder lattice with a view of the distant stars through tell me I am yet upon earth.
Aye, she sees, and the talisman has played me false. Accursed be it, and the head it grew upon,
muttered Don Rolando through his clenched teeth. He was about to rush forward and bury his dagger in her very heart, for his vanity and pride would not allow him to permit her to see his features inasmuch as he already loved her. And the thought to Don Rolando of seeing the lady shudder at his ugliness was madness to him. He had rather slay her with his own hand. And this he was about to do when suddenly his arm was arrested by a light touch. He turned and beheld a low black figure with a body no higher than his knees, with a prodigious head, in the brow of which was set a single eye of green flame like a shining emerald, and with his hands and arms of supernatural length.
"Avaunt, fiend!"
he cried, starting back with horror and affright.
"Fear me not, Don Rolando," said the dwarf in hoarse, low tones. "I know thy disappointment. Yes, she has eyes brighter than stars, that one." "By heaven she hath! How know you my thoughts and purposes?"
demanded he with surprise.
"It matters not, Don Rolando, it matters not. But I can aid thy purpose." "How?" "I can destroy her vision." "Thou hell-hound, wouldst thou mar such glorious beauty? She shall die first by my own hand."
"Hold, Don Rolando. I will not mar that beauty. No, I will not mar it. I will take away her sight, but not lay a hand upon her."
"Give me proof of it, and thou shalt attempt it. I would give half my wealth could it be so. Give me proof."
The demon dwarf fixed upon him his single eye for an instant with such a steady gaze that Don Rolando's eyes were irresistibly riveted upon it as if fascinated. In vain Don Rolando tried to take them off. They were no longer subservient to his will. The demon dwarf's eye grew larger and larger, brighter and brighter each moment, till the light of it became painfully intense, and seemed to be Don Rolando's eyes, to fill the whole space before him and to pervade the whole room. By degrees it then faded away, lessening, growing dimmer and dimmer, until it left the place to his vision dark as midnight.
"Where art thou, you fiend, that thou hast charmed me thus and left me in the darkness? Where are you?"
"Don Rolando, dost thou find thyself in darkness?" said the dwarf, speaking from the self-same spot where Don Rolando had last seen him.
"Art thou here, demon? Who hath extinguished the lights?"
"No lights are extinguished, Don Rolando. The darkness is in thine own vision. Thou art stone blind."
"Thou liest! Ho, light, light, knaves, bring light!
Thou mayest call for light, went on the demon dwarf. Yes, thou mayst call for light till they rival in brightness the sun, and thou shalt not see their brilliancy.
Fiend, hast thou done this?
With a single glance of my eye, Don Rolando, I have given thee but the proof thou didst seek. Look upon me once more.
I see thee not.
Uh, be patient, and I will restore thy vision.
The demon then placed a finger upon each eye of Don Rolando, and pressing upon them asked if he saw 2 golden rings. I do, answered Don Rolando.
Fix thy inward gaze upon them, as steadily as but now you fixed your external gaze upon my eye.
Don Rolando did this with an effort, and by degrees the golden rings he saw enlarged until they seemed to be in a universe of roseate light. The dwarf then removed his fingers and opened his eyes. All around Don Rolando seemed an atmosphere of pale light, but no object was visible. Gradually the light assumed a delicate blue shade and then a green color and seemed to gather itself into a circle opposite to him. This circle gradually lessened in size and increased in brilliancy. He kept his eyes steadily upon it as if by a supernatural energy, until it diminished to a small orb. That orb was the dwarf's eye, whom he now beheld standing in his presence as before. "It is enough. Thou shalt make use of thy power," said Don Rolando. "She is on yonder couch."
Yes, there. The terms, yes, the terms are the children she may bring thee,
said the dwarf without moving.
Don Rolando started. He saw that his visitor was resolute.
"Well, it is but a contingency at the best," thought he. I consent to your terms. The souls of the children she may give me."
Well then, Don Rolando, lay thy thumb and forefinger upon my eyelid, and it shall be thy oath.
Don Rolando did so. The dwarf then placed himself at the foot of the couch in shadow, so that his bright green eye alone was visible from it. It instantly arrested the maiden's eyes, and her glance was fascinated. In a few moments her vision was forever darkened. That demon departed as suddenly as he had appeared, and Don Rolando stood by the couch of the now blind maiden. He watched her motions. Her gaze was vacant, and her hands moved like one who is in the dark.
Alas, alas, whither am I born? Oh, to what fate am I doomed? A moment since all was bright and gorgeous, and now all is dark as midnight. I deny, hapless vessel.
"Nay, sweet lady," said Rolando in a gentle tone, for though his visage was hideous, his voice was soft and harmonious. "You were brought from the damp cellars of the cloister to the halls of luxury and affluence, to a noble castle that waits to hail you as its mistress, and to a true knight's home, who is ready to lay his heart and honor at your very feet." Thus, and in like manner, spoke Don Rolando. His soothing voice and tender speech at length won her ear, and she listened to him with pleasure. But the story of his wooing and nuptials, and of her submission to her blindness, for which she could not account, and which, be it mentioned here, did nothing to mar her beauty. Yes, this must be passed over for years. Years rolled by, and Don Rolando had become the father of 7 beautiful daughters, every one of whom had been born upon Christmas Eve. He loved his lovely and sightless wife each succeeding year more and more. Blessings seemed to flow in upon him on every side. The only desire Don Rolando now had to complete his happiness was for a son,
that he might give him heir to his name and vast estates. Yes, but this wish he was never destined to see fulfilled. But at length his eldest daughter reached her 18th year, and a neighboring young noble who had won her heart and was to lead her to the altar on her birthday eve. The bridal party were assembled. The rites were performed. The hours of festivity flew on with joy and hope. The bride, who was scarcely less lovely than Henri's bride, was in the midst of a waltz when the castle clock tolled 12. Ere the last stroke from that clock had ceased vibrating upon the ears of the banqueters, there entered the hall a tall, dark stranger in a green velvet dress richly studded with emeralds. In his bonnet was a sable plume fastened by an emerald that glowed like fire, and at his belt was a hunting horn. His aspect was noble, his face intellectual. His entrance drew nearly all eyes upon him, but there was something about him that made Don Rolando's heart shrink with an ominous foreboding, almost as if he sensed a disquieting metamorphosis. He strode across the hall to the spot where Don Rolando was seated, and said in a low tone, "Don Rolando, I have come for thy daughter." Don Rolando started back and looked him in the face for an instant, and then with a shriek fell backward in the arms of his attendants. Leaving him, the stranger then approached the bride as she yet circled in the waltz, for while in its giddy mazes she had not yet noticed his entrance. He stood near her and sought to catch her eye, and he succeeded. Instantly she stopped as if paralyzed, and then without turning her glance aside from his steady gaze, she approached him. He receded from her as she did so, still keeping upon her his riveted gaze, which seemed to fascinate her like a serpent's. For as he moved across the hall, she followed him as if irresistibly drawn along solely by the power of his eye. He now took his way through the hall in the direction of the outer gate of the castle, steadily looking backward towards her over his shoulder, while like a hound she continued to follow, step for step, all arrayed in her bridal robes and sparkling with jewels, with a face like death's and eyes supernaturally dilated. She went on after him, looking neither to the right nor to the left. Ah, poor little maiden! Without once removing his glance from her terrified eyes, the stranger passed out of the hall, descended the marble steps to the court below, and crossed the court to the outer gate, and through the hall, corridor, and courtyard. The charmed bride followed him, keeping the same distance behind until she disappeared after him through the portal. Of the guests, all were at first paralyzed, and followed them at a distance, the boldest, not even the bridegroom himself, having power to attempt her rescue. Slowly behind her they followed, with silent amazement and horror, till the ill-fated bride had disappeared through the gate when the spell that seemed to have bound all present was finally broken. "Ho, cavaliers and gentlemen, to the rescue!" was the universal cry. But ere they reached the gate, they heard the receding footsteps of a horseman and the full cry of hounds, as if a huntsman was scouring the country at the head of his pack. Those sounds soon died away in a distant glen, and from that night forward nothing was ever heard of the bride that had been so strangely charmed away. The next day, Don Rolando, who alone could unravel this mystery, sent 10,000 golden pistoles to the convent from whence he had abducted his wife 19 years before, praying that masses might be nightly offered for his daughter's soul. 2 more years elapsed, and time, which heals all things, had in some degree thrown over this event its oblivious veil, when the second daughter, not less lovely than the eldest, attained her 18th year, and on her birth night was led to the altar by a noble Aragonese cavalier. As before, it was a night of mirth and festivity, alas for it! When the clock struck 12, the bride was just entering her bridal chamber, and on the threshold she looked back to receive Don Rolando's blessing when her eye encountered the fixed glance of the swart stranger. With a shudder, she turned back from the very threshold of her bridal chamber and followed the stranger at a short distance behind, through the hall, through the court and corridor, to the outer gate of the castle, and again were heard a moment afterwards the huntsman and his hounds coursing up the glen. And again the cavaliers present, till now spellbound, rushed forth to the rescue. But never from that time forward was the intelligence of the fate of the second daughter of Don Rolando Osorno. By a strange fatality, the bridal night was always on the birthday night, which happened ever on a Christmas Eve, the anniversary of the night on which Don Rolando committed the sacrilege of abducting the novice.
Well, hush. Doubtless Holy Church had something to do with this terrible punishment
And the loss of his daughters, yeah, said Eugene Brissot.
Don Antonio Baradas smiled coldly and significantly. Without replying, continued his story.
That these nuptials should be suffered to take place a second, and indeed a third time, after such a horrible consummation of them, is no less strange than that the parties should be so little affected by the circumstances that ought to have made a lasting impression on every mind. It would seem that Don Rolando and his friends and his daughter's wooers were, one and all, afflicted with a judicial blindness. Yes, a third, a fourth, and a fifth bridal took place, with 2 years' interval between each, with precisely the same results. The nightly appearance at the stroke of 12 of the dark stranger, the fascination of the bride, her submissive following and disappearance with the retiring sound of horse and hounds winding up the glen. And what is most remarkable connected with this affair was that at each visit of the dark stranger, the sightless mother recovered her vision during the time he was present, but immediately lost it on his departure. At the loss of her fifth daughter, that sad lady died of a broken heart for her bereavements. At length Don Rolando roused himself at this series of judgments and resolved to avert the fate of his 2 remaining daughters, one of whom was 16, and the other, and youngest of all, but 6 years of age. And for this purpose, Don Rolando secretly left his castle and his native land, and he came hither, as if the wide sea were a wall between justice and the adjudged. He built yonder solitary and gloomy mansion, and he defended its portals with iron gates. He consecrated every stone with holy water, and in every threshold sunk a silver cross. The 2 years elapsed as before. In strange infatuation, he suffered his daughter to be led to the altar on her 18th birthday. A wealthy and high-born young Creole had wooed and won her. Don Rolando gave his consent, believing the power he dreaded could not reach him here. He wished, too, with a resistless curiosity, to relieve his mind by this trial. He incurred the risk and sacrificed his daughter. Or did the green stranger appear then?
Asked every voice.
Oh, yes. And true to the hour and stroke of midnight, the bride followed him from the drawing rooms across the lawn, and a moment afterwards the sound of horse and horn resounded along the winding shore, till lost in the dark cypress forest to the south. The guests fled from the fatal halls in terror, but none could afterwards tell the tale or describe the scene. The spell seemed to have been laid upon their memories. All was confused and indistinct when they would recall it, but the impression of a supernatural presence there on that night remained uneffaced. And from that time the haunted villa became the scene of mysteries no man could unravel. The morning after this supernatural event, Monsieur Viginald, at present our noble host, was surprised at the entrance of Don Rolando leading in his youthful daughter, a beautiful child then in her 8th year. To him, our host, Don Rolando consigned him, after telling him the strange story you have heard me relate. And with Monsieur Viginald, Don Rolando left the keys to coffers of gold in the vaults of his mansion, and then blessing his final daughter, he took leave of her forever. Yes, Don Rolando is now as a rigid and holy monk doing penance day and night in the monastery which he had so sacrilegiously violated. But, where is Monsieur Vaginard? Methinks I have not seen him present among you.
A low groan now arrested every ear. The figure lay upon the ground in a kneeling posture. It was Monsieur Vaginald. He had fainted there at the first sight of the spectacle the haunted villa had presented. Ifsa had been to him as his own child. He felt that the curse had not departed from her race, and had fallen forward insensible with a cry of mercy, mercy for her on his lips. They lifted him up and laid him upon an ottoman. Those who assisted him were scarce more alive than himself. Don Antonio's tale had filled the soul of every one that listened to it with horror. Henri Clavier, the bridegroom, stood before Don Antonio like a statue of stone, and all eyes were fixed upon the young Spaniard in silence. They expected something, they knew not what, but something that would harrow their senses and chill their blood. The connection of the fearful tale with the bride was too plain to be mistaken.
"For let us save her or die with her, good Don Antonio,"
cried Eugene Brissot.
Hark! It is 12 o'clock!
They cried, and in the deep voice of fearful expectation.
It's the Cathedral Bell! Oh, the saints preserve us!
Fell from every pallid lip. At the last stroke, Don Antonio cast aside his silken cloak, and from his tall figure, and stood before them, the Green Huntsman, the swart stranger of his own tale. Without a word he left them, and entering the drawing-room from the veranda, he crossed it to the door through which Ifsa had gone with her bridesmaids. It opened ere he touched it. Passing on, he traversed a suite of lighted rooms until he came to the door of the nuptial chamber. Disrobed of her rich bridal attire, Ifsa was standing among her bridesmaids in a robe de chambre and a cap of snowy white that made her look, if possible, still more lovely than ever. The door swung open, and Don Antonio instantly fixed his eye upon hers and turned to leave the chamber. Ifsa clasped her hands together in agony, as if instinctively she knew her fate, and followed him. He did not keep his eyes upon her constantly, but strode forward without looking behind, as if satisfied she followed. Twice she stopped and stood still, wringing her hands supplicatingly, but he had only to glance back over his shoulder at these times, and Ifsa came crouching along close to his feet. And thus the Green Huntsman led the ill-fated bride into the hall and forth upon the veranda. Here stood Henriette, here stood Eugene Brissot and their friends. They beheld him advancing and saw him pass by close to the spot where they stood. They saw, oh horror, oh heavenly pity, they saw, too, the poor Ifsa following him, now stopping and wringing her snowy hands as he took his eyes from her, and now as he turned and fixed them upon her, crouching and moving on mournfully in his fatal footsteps. And yet they could move neither hand nor foot to save her. Henri's eyes followed his bride with a glassy stare, and the brave Eugene Brissot seemed divested of every vital function and sense save the single sense of horror. Thrice the lovely Ifsa tried to turn and look upon her husband, but each time his eye arrested the movement of her head and drew her still on after him. From the veranda they traversed the lawn, reached the gate, and passed through it. The next moment was heard the galloping of the horse, the sound of hounds, and those on the veranda distinctly beheld the Green Huntsman, riding like the wind in the direction of the haunted villa, bearing before him in his saddle the helpless victim bride. And as he rode, they saw his form change. For he seemed to emit a horrid shining light that exhibited him as plainly as noonday to their vision, and he assumed the form of a hideous demon dwarf. On rode the demon and his victim, and on followed the pack of black hounds baying in full cry. All at once the haunted villa became illuminated as before, with a red glare through the windows, portal, and crevice, while again the writhing tongue of green flame lapped the air and shed a baleful light a league around. The demon, with his victim borne before him and followed by his whole sable pack, now turned into the lawn and rode toward that infernal mansion at the wildest speed. Without pausing, they all, rider, victim, horse, and hound, dashed to the yawning portal and leaped into the midst of the glowing furnace. Shrieks and yells most piercing and appalling rent the air. The flames were suddenly extinguished, and in an instant darkness and terrible gloom shrouded the spot where a moment before seemed to yawn the sulphurous mouth of hell. And such is the legend of the haunted villa, and such is the penalty of a parent's crime, which sooner or later heaven will punish, even to making wicked spirits the instruments of its vengeance. You've just heard tonight's story from Storylink Radio's Countdown to Halloween 2022. Remember to come back for our next tale. Many more stories of all genres available to listen to and read along with now on our website at www.storylinkradio.com. Visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StorylinkRadio. And visit our podcast for easy mobile listening anywhere, anytime. Just search for Storylink Radio on your favorite podcast provider. Oh, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click that alert bell for Storylink Radio.